AP Psychology. So this is our flipped video number 2, and we're continuing to look at the foundations of psychology as we start the year. We got to set the basis so that we can refer back to some of these foundations as we continue to learn about psychology this school year. So today we're going to focus on the different perspectives of psychology, and you can see those perspectives here listed. And as we go through the year, we will continually refer back to these different theories and what the different ideas are and how certain schools of thought for psychology, how they perceive individual behavior and how they approach things like therapy. So in understanding these theories, it helps us understand why there are so many different interpretations of human behavior. So this is a really important foundation, really important basis to get down and stick in your memory for the year. So let's get going on these different perspectives. So we're going to start right off with one of, I guess you could say, more controversial perspectives in psychology. And for many of us, when we think of psychology, Sigmund Freud he's the guy. I mean, for some people, you may have even considered him to be the father of psychology, which we know is actually William James' first textbook. But in terms of beliefs about the mind, Sigmund Freud kind of started things off. And it was highly controversial because some of his focuses were a little off the beaten track as people continued to study psychology. But some of those key terms and key words that you want to connect with the psychoanalytic theory and Sigmund Freud, he had a belief that our behavior and our responses to things in life were all stored in the unconscious mind. And things like our repressed memories, when things happen to us, those memories are stored in our mind and they infiltrate our behavior. He spent a lot of time considering what our childhood relationships were like, especially with our moms and our dads. And I'm not going to lie, it gets a little weird. And we'll spend a lot of time in the coming units reflecting back and referring back to Sigmund Freud and his beliefs. So I don't want to spend a ton of time here delving into the psychoanalytic theory. So keywords: unconscious mind, repressed memory, things like the id, the ego, and the superego. Those were parts of our personality that Freud believed explained who we are, sort of this good cop, bad cop kind of idea. So there's some perceptions of Freud that when you would go to see him and he would want to help you, analyze you, that you would lie down on this black couch, and by lying there you were able to go into the deep recesses of your unconscious mind and analyze your dreams and talk about those unconscious childhood memories that you've repressed. And so that's the explanation of that little bitmoji there. And Freud didn't believe anything was an accident, that there was always a reason that could explain why you might say, it's when you say one word and mean your mother, another. And that's what we call a Freudian slip. So just a little psychology humor there for you. The next perspective, or the next theory of psychology, is what we call the behavioral theory. And again, we will spend a great deal of time on these theorists when we get into our unit on learning. But the big names, the big guns, the most prominent psychologists in the behavioral theory include John Watson, Ivan Pavlov, and B.F. Skinner. And these guys believe that our behavior is learned. So in terms of nature and nurture, we learn it, we are nurtured, our environment creates who we are. So all of our behavior is learned. And then to understand behavior, we have to be able to observe it. And there was a definite belief that psychology needs to be scientific. You know, people like Freud and your unconscious mind and analyzing your dreams, like, no, these guys would say. We need to be able to observe behavior and document it. So these are the behaviorists. So just a little bit about some of these guys a little more specifically. And again, we'll go into their studies more thoroughly as the year goes on. Watson's most famous experiment centered around a baby named Albert, little Albert. And Watson believed that our emotions like fear could be conditioned. That when we're born, we are this blank slate, tabula rasa, John Locke. We're a blank slate. We are conditioned. We learn to be afraid. Our parents do that to us. They put a nightlight in our room. We weren't afraid of the dark until they put that nightlight. And then all of a sudden we get used to the little bit of light. And then when it's dark, it doesn't seem right. We've been conditioned to be afraid. So we'll go in to Watson, and you'll actually get to see some of his you'll see baby Albert and what those experiments were like. We'll learn a little bit more about him in our coming class meets. Ivan Pavlov, he is the infamous dog psychologist. Pavlov rings his bell. The dog has been conditioned and has learned, because behaviorists are all about learned behaviors. The dog learns that it's time to eat. And these dogs were conditioned to salivate at the sound of the bell. And Pavlov's beliefs is that our behavior is the product of prior experience. So we learn that we hear a bell. The dogs learned that when they hear a bell, that it's time to eat. This is called classical conditioning, and there's a lot of other layers to this that, again, we'll hit more in detail as the year goes. B.F. Skinner, another prominent behaviorist, talks about and focused on reinforcement, and that our behaviors can be reinforced if things are given to us, some rewards, or if we are denied some things. We want to reinforce certain behaviors. And he used rats and pigeons and a lot of things with food. Food's given as a reward. It's the greatest reward for you guys. Anytime there's a contest, what's the ultimate reward? Oh, it's a pizza party. It's a root beer float party, whatever. You know the drill. So those are the behaviorists. The next perspective is the humanistic theory. And if you can just remember the key root word in humanistic, it's human. And this idea that human beings are self-directed. We, the human, the person, is directed to do and make the choices that they want to. And that we as people are always evolving to become the best version of ourselves that we can. And the prominent humanistic theorists or psychologists are Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. And just for the record, Carl Rogers is not the Mr. Rogers, although an easy way to remember this and what we know about Mr. Rogers, and he was that kind and loving and accepting and generous and colorblind individual. And if you remember the name Rogers and all of those traits of Mr. Rogers, it very much ties into the humanistic theory. But some key words that go with the humanistic theory are self-actualization and free will. And free will, it's the idea that we have the choice. We decide our destiny. And the idea with self-actualization, that correlates with Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs that you see here in this pyramid. And that ultimately we have to meet the needs at each of these levels. And ultimately, when we have all of our needs met, ultimately we can become the most that we can. We have reached self-actualization. And that's a key component of the humanistic theory. The cognitive theory centers around how we process, store, and use information. And the ways that we process, store, and use information is generally going to revolve around the ideas of how we think and how we learn. So be sure that you don't confuse that word learning with the behaviorists, okay? Learning this is going to be the process of learning. And so with the cognitive theory, this information that we get, that we've processed, stored, and used, it's going to influence our thinking, language, and problem solving. Jean Piaget is a prominent cognitive theorist. He's also a developmental theorist, and he focused on our different phases in our life and how as a newborn baby that we are developing and we are learning how to process and store information. And then as an adolescent, we are doing the same things, but we have different skill levels. And all of that has to do with, again, how we process information and how we think. So those are the cognitive theorists. The biological theory has to do with biology. And this is probably one of the most fastest growing fields of psychology. A lot of new information, continually learning about how biology complements, interacts, can explain human behavior. So you might sometimes see it as the neurobiological theory or neurobiology, anything that you see something that is physical that's going to go under this same umbrella. So it's how the body and the brain creates our emotions, our memories, and those sensory experiences. And within that theory, it's going to be anything that is connected to the brain, hormones, our genetics, DNA, inherited traits, and the nervous system. And you throw in things like neurotransmitters and chemical imbalances, and all of those fall under the biological theory. There are a pair of neuropsychologists by the name of Sperry and Gazzaniga, and they are probably the most prominent, most famous names to connect with this theory. And their research focused on maybe stroke patients, people who had lost the ability to use one side of their brain, and that the brain has something called plasticity. And so if you lose the ability to work part of your brain, the other half of your brain will evolve and take over. And that very much falls into this biological theory. And their work is going to be something that we, again, dive deeper into this year. Socio-cultural theory. So socio, people, cultural, our backgrounds, our practices, our religion, where we live, are we male or female, are we young or old, all of those components about people have an impact on our behavior and our social functioning. So that's what the sociocultural theory is going to focus on. So those key words are going to be religion, geography, gender, age. Those explain and help to explain and will help lead you to identifying the sociocultural theory. The evolutionary theory is going to be most connected with Charles Darwin. Although he wasn't a psychologist, his beliefs and his ideas definitely have been adopted by some psychologists who believe that our behaviors come from his idea of survival of the fittest, that we learn to behave certain ways because if we don't, we won't survive, that we have certain traits that are advantageous to our behavior. And whether those are protective instincts or instincts led to for success. These can all be explained by the evolutionary theorists. So here's the thing. It is really impossible in this day and age to say that a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, a psychiatrist, a counselor is going to just use one of these approaches to explain behavior. And what has happened in modern psychology, they have looked at some of these founding perspectives and they really have created more of a mixture of approaching human behavior. And it's not just one way of thinking about behavior. And the term that we use to explain that is what's called eclectic. And modern psychology is an eclectic approach to psychology. It's more than just one perspective. Later this year, when we begin to look at how we treat people with disorders, we will look at these different perspectives and how they would approach treatment. But what you'll find is for someone who maybe has something like an eating disorder, it's very much going to be an eclectic approach. We want to change their perception of themselves. So we're going to have to change their thinking. That would be cognitive. But we also want to have them learn new ways of doing things. We want to change their behavior, condition them to respond differently. So there's a behaviorist theory. And what if there's some sort of chemical imbalance that could explain their behavior? So you can see how this eclectic approach can play out in how we handle individuals' behaviors and trying to offer help. So as we wrap up this first module, the Foundations of Psychology, I just want to reinforce or let you know or tell you the things that psychology is not. This is an amazing class, and you're going to learn all kinds of things about human behavior and the human mind, and it's going to be really easy as we go through the class to see yourself in some of these scenarios, or your best friend, or your parents. But here's the thing. We are not licensed therapists. We are not doctors of psychology. I am not any of those things. So, this is really not meant to be a therapy class or a self-help class. But if it does those things for you, that's great. But just be cautious and don't expect that you're going to come out of here and be fixed or be able to fix others. We're also not going to learn things about mind reading and tricks, and you're not going to have absolute control and be able to shift and guide people's behaviors. We'll have some fun along the way for sure, and I am known to play a little trick on you, but all in the sake of learning, I promise. So we've finished this module, and the College Board wants to be sure that you can recognize those different perspectives, those early perspectives that shaped psychological thought, structuralists, functionalists, their ideas. We've just gone through the different theoretical approaches of psychology to explain behavior, and you know the different domains of psychology and how psychology can be filtered out into real life and the real world. So good job. Review your notes, write down any questions you might have, and I'll see you next time. Good work. Nice job, psychology.